I wore black to bury my husband. Not because I loved him, because black was expected. Because grief, like marriage, was something I had learned to perform. The church smelled like lilies and candle wax, sweet enough to make me sick. Every pew was full. Every eye was on me. The grieving widower, the poor Omega, the beautiful young thing left behind. I stood beside the casket with my hands folded neatly in front of me, dressed in silk and silence, while strangers whispered prayers for a man who had ruined my life. Elias Vaughn, my husband, dead at 32, and everyone in the room mourned him like he had been a saint. I stared at the polished mahogany coffin and tried to feel something holy. Relief, then guilt for the relief, then nothing at all. You should cry. My mother's voice slipped between her teeth like poison, soft enough that only I could hear it. She stood beside me in immaculate black lace. One gloved hand curled around her rosary, the picture of devotion. To everyone else, she looked like a grieving mother-in-law. To me, she looked like the woman who had sold me. "People are watching, Lucian," she murmured, not moving her lips. "At least try to look devastated." I kept my eyes on the coffin. I'm trying not to smile. Her fingers dug into my wrist hard enough to bruise. Careful. I almost laughed. That was the word they had used my whole life. Careful what you say. Careful what you want. Careful who sees you bleeding. I had been careful for 3 years. Careful when Elias came home smelling like another Alpha's cologne and expensive whiskey. Careful when he touched me only when he was angry. Careful when he reminded me that I was pretty, expensive, and entirely his. The last time he backhanded me across the breakfast table, I had smiled. That was the worst part. He liked when I didn't break. And now he was dead, collapsed in the back seat of his own car with a heart full of secrets and violence. A tragedy, they called it. A shame. Terrible loss. I called it the first good thing that had happened to me since I was 19. I stood at the grave while they lowered him into the earth. My mother-in-law, Patricia Vaughn, sobbed into a handkerchief and clutched my arm like I was her last remaining family. I let her. I had learned to let people touch me without feeling it. Dirt hit the coffin. Thud, thud, each one a small, private celebration. When the last shovel fell, Patricia turned to me with red-rimmed eyes. "You'll stay with us tonight. You shouldn't be alone." It wasn't an offer. I smiled. The smile I had perfected. Soft, empty, believable. "Of course, Patricia. Whatever you need." She nodded, satisfied, and walked toward the waiting limousine. My mother appeared at my other elbow. "You'll do as she says. The Vaughns are still your family. You owe them." I looked at the fresh grave. "I don't owe them anything." My mother's grip tightened. "You owe them everything. That ring on your finger is worth more than your life." I looked down at the ring, a massive diamond, a cage in the shape of a jewel. "Then take it," I said quietly. "I never wanted it." She hissed something under her breath and pulled me toward the limousine. I went, because I was still being careful, but not for much longer. The Vaughn estate was a mansion of cold marble and colder silences. I had lived here for 3 years. I knew every locked door, every painting that hid a camera, every room where screaming could not be heard. Patricia poured herself a brandy and sat in Elias's favorite chair. The same chair where he had once held my face too tight and whispered, "Your mind, Lucian. Not even death will change that." He was wrong about so many things. "You'll stay in the East Wing," Patricia said, not looking at me. "The lawyer will come tomorrow to read the will. Until then, you are not to leave this house." I nodded. She didn't say please. She never did. I climbed the stairs slowly, my hands sliding along the mahogany railing. The house smelled like him, like sandalwood and whiskey and old rage. I stopped outside the bedroom we had shared. I had not slept in that bed for 6 months. Not since the night he had locked me in the closet for talking back. I had stood in the dark for 8 hours, breathing through my mouth, pressing my palms against the door until they bled. He had let me out in the morning. He had kissed my forehead and said, "You understand now, don't you?" I had said yes. I had learned to say yes to everything. I walked past the bedroom, past the closet, past the room where he kept his guns, his whips, and his secrets. I went to the smallest room in the east wing, the one with the window that faced the garden, the one with a lock on the inside. I closed the door and turned the lock. For the first time in 3 years, I breathed. I sat on the narrow bed and pulled off my gloves. My hands were shaking, not from grief, from adrenaline, from the terrible, wonderful weight of freedom pressing against my ribs. I looked at my reflection in the dark window. I was 22 years old. My face was still young. My eyes were still clear. My body still bore the marks he had left. A faded bruise here, a thin scar there, nothing that couldn't be hidden with the right clothes and the right lies. But my soul was tired. I had been sold to Elias Vaughn when I was 19. My mother had signed the contract. My father had looked away. The family elders had called it a good match. Elias was rich, powerful, connected. He was also cruel, possessive, and utterly convinced that an Omega existed only to serve. I had served. I had smiled. I had cooked. I had spread my legs and closed my eyes and pretended that the man on top of me was someone else. Anyone else. And now he was dead. The next morning, the lawyer arrived. He was a thin beta with spectacles and a voice like dry leaves. He sat in Elias's study, the one with the soundproof walls, and unfolded the will with trembling hands. Patricia sat across from him. My mother stood behind her like a loyal guard dog. I sat at the end of the table, the widow, the last person anyone expected to leave with anything. The lawyer cleared his throat. The will of Elias Vaughn, dated 3 months prior to his death. He read the formalities, the assets, the properties, the family holdings. All of it went to Patricia. I wasn't surprised. Then he paused. There is one additional provision. Patricia leaned forward. Yes. The lawyer looked at me. My heart stopped. To my beloved mate Lucian Vaughn I leave the following: the cabin at Blackwater Lake, a monthly stipend of $5,000, and my blessing to remarry, provided that I am not forgotten. Silence. Patricia's face went pale. Then, that cabin is mine, she hissed. The lawyer adjusted his spectacles. It was his to give, Mrs. Vaughn. He wouldn't, he couldn't. He did. I sat perfectly still. The cabin, the money, the blessing to remarry, as if I needed his permission to live. Patricia turned to me, her eyes blazing. You will not take a cent. I met her gaze. It's mine. You think you can defy this family? I think, I said slowly, standing up, that your son is dead, and I am not. My mother grabbed my arm. Lucian, sit down. I shook her off. For the first time in 3 years, I shook her off. I will take the cabin, I said, looking at Patricia. I will take the money, and then I will leave this house and never come back. Patricia laughed. Cold, brittle sound. You think anyone else will want you? You're used, Lucian. You're damaged. You have nothing except what my son gave you. I looked down at my ring, the diamond that had felt like a shackle. Pulled it off. Set it on the table. It made a small, final sound against the wood. Keep it, I said. I don't need his ring. I don't need his name. And I don't need you. I walked out of the study, out of the mansion, out of the life I had been sold into. The sun was bright. The air was cold. And for the first time in 3 years, I was not being watched. I stood at the edge of the driveway and looked up at the sky. Then I started walking. I walked for 2 hours before a truck stopped. The driver was an elderly woman with kind eyes and a cab full of grocery bags. She looked at my black shirt, my bare hands, my feet already blistering in funeral heels, and she didn't ask questions. Where to, sweetheart? Blackwater Lake, I said. She raised an eyebrow but didn't comment, just nodded and pointed to the passenger seat. I got in. The truck smelled like coffee and old leather. Nothing like the Vaughn mansion. Nothing like Elias. I rolled down the window and let the cold air hit my face until my cheeks went numb. The woman turned on the radio. Country music. Low and easy. She didn't try to talk to me. I was grateful. I thanked the woman, Then she drove away. I stood in the cold and looked at the place that was now mine. The cabin was smaller than I remembered. I had seen it once, 3 years ago, when Elias had brought me here for a single weekend. He had spent most of that weekend drunk and angry about something I couldn't remember. I had spent it hiding in the bedroom, reading the same page of a book over and over, waiting for him to fall asleep. The cabin sat at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by pines and silence. The lake was gray under the sky. The dock looked like it hadn't been used in years. The key was under the third flower pot, just like Elias had told the lawyer. I found it with frozen fingers and let myself in. The air inside was stale. Dust covered every surface. But the walls were thick, the windows were intact, and there was a wood stove in the corner. I could work with this. I walked through the rooms, a kitchen, a living room, then finally the bedroom. No cameras. No Patricia. No mother. I sat on the edge of the bed and put my head in my hands. I didn't cry. I hadn't cried in 3 years. I sat there for a long time, breathing in the dust and the silence, and I let myself feel something that wasn't relief. It was fear. Not of Elias. He was dead. Fear of what came next. I had never lived alone. I had never made a decision that wasn't approved by someone else. I had never even bought my own groceries. I was 22 years old, and I had no idea how to be free. The first week was hard. I cleaned the cabin. I chopped wood for the stove. I drove the truck the lawyer had left in the garage, Elias's hunting truck, into the nearest town for supplies. The town was small. A general store, a diner, a gas station. People looked at me like they knew who I was. Maybe they did. The Vaughn name stretched far. I kept my head down. At night, I sat by the wood stove and read old paperbacks I found on the cabin's shelves. Romance novels, murder mysteries, anything that wasn't real. The silence was loud, but it was mine. After a week, I had a visitor. I was on the dock, staring at the frozen lake, when I heard footsteps on the gravel. I turned. A man was walking toward me. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a worn flannel jacket and boots that had seen better days. His hair was dark, curling at the edges, and his face was all sharp angles and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from stone. An alpha. I could tell from the way he moved, confident, unhurried, like the world owed him space. I tensed. He stopped a few feet away. His eyes were the color of the lake, gray, deep, unreadable. "You're the Vaughn widow," he said. Not a question. "Lucian," I said. "Just Lucian." He tilted his head, studying me. "I'm Silas. I live 2 miles down the road." He nodded toward the cabin. "Saw the lights on at night. Wanted to make sure no one had broken in." "No one broke in. It's me." Silas's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Curiosity, maybe. "Elias Vaughn's cabin," he said slowly. "He left it to me. And you came here willingly?" The question was strange, too pointed. I wrapped my arms around myself. "Is that a problem?" Silas was quiet for a moment. The wind picked up, rattling the bare branches of the pines. "No problem," he said finally. "Just surprising. Most people would sell a place with so many memories." I looked at the cabin, at the frozen lake, at the gray sky. "I don't have anywhere else to go." Silas nodded slowly. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "There's a town meeting tomorrow night. The Lake Association meets once a month. You should come." He held out the paper. "It'll help you understand the area." I took the paper. Our fingers didn't touch. "Thank you," I said. Silas looked at me for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back down the gravel road, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. He didn't look back. I watched him go. The paper in my hand had an address scribbled on it. Nothing else. I went inside and lit the wood stove. That night I dreamed of Elias. He was standing in the doorway of the bedroom, blocking the light. His voice was low and calm, the way it got right before he hurt me. "You think you can leave? You think a piece of paper makes you free?" I woke up gasping. The cabin was dark. The wood stove had burned down to embers. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, my hands shaking. I checked the door. Locked. The windows. Latched. There was no one there. But I didn't sleep again. The town meeting was held in the basement of the community church. I almost didn't go. But the cabin was too quiet, my thoughts were too loud, and I needed to remember that other people existed. I wore jeans and a sweater. No makeup. No jewelry. I looked like someone else. Someone ordinary. The basement was full of folding chairs and stern faces. Mostly betas, a few alphas, no omegas except me. I sat in the back. Silas was there near the front. He didn't look at me. The meeting was boring. Water rights. Road maintenance. Someone's dog that kept getting loose. I listened and tried to look like I belonged. After the meeting ended, I stood near the wall, watching. An older woman approached me, plump with kind brown eyes. "You're Elias's widow," she said. "Lucian." "Margaret." She smiled. "I'm sorry for your loss." Everyone was sorry. No one knew what they were sorry for. "Thank you," I said, without meaning it. "You staying at the cabin?" she asked. "Yes." She nodded and walked away. I drove home in the dark, but the road didn't feel as cold as before. The meeting had been boring. The people had been distant, but Margaret had been kind. And Silas hadn't looked at me once during the meeting. But when I was leaving, I felt his gaze on my back, just for a second, just long enough to notice. I pulled into the cabin's driveway and sat in the truck, staring at the small dark windows. Then I went inside. I sat on the couch with a romance novel in my lap. But I didn't read. I stared at the fire and thought about those gray eyes. Silas's eyes. I slept through the whole night. No dreams. No nightmares. Just the soft crackle of the fire and the distant hoot of an owl. The following day, the cabin was quieter. Not the silence of fear, the silence of settling. I learned the rhythms of the cabin. When the sun hit the kitchen window. How to start a fire without burning my fingers. I learned to be alone. It was harder than I expected. Not because I missed Elias. I didn't. But because I had spent 3 years being watched. Every move I made, every word I spoke, every breath I took. Someone had been there to judge it. Now there was no one. And I didn't know who I was when no one was looking. The memory hit me. 7 years ago, the art gallery garden. I was 15. I didn't wear black then. I wore a sunflower yellow sweater that was 2 sizes too big and paint-stained jeans. My fingers were perpetually smudged with charcoal because I couldn't stop drawing the world around me. "Lucian, you're going to catch a cold." I looked up from my sketchbook. My best friend, Leo, was standing under the porch of the community center, waving a frantic hand at me. I laughed. A real laugh. The kind that started in my chest and made my eyes crinkle. "It's just water, Leo. Look at the sky, the gray is turning into violet. I have to catch it before it fades." I didn't care about my hair getting ruined. I didn't care about being pretty or composed. I was a boy who wanted to paint the wind. That evening, I went home with damp clothes and a heart full of colors. My father was in the kitchen, and for a brief window of time, he smiled when he saw me. "My artist is back," he'd say, ruffling my hair. There was no contract. No alpha-omega dynamics that felt like a death sentence. There was just a boy who dreamed of going to Paris, of owning a tiny studio with big windows, and of falling in love with someone who liked the way he smelled like turpentine and vanilla. I had a voice then. I used to sing in the shower. I used to argue with my teachers about the brushstrokes in Van Gogh's Starry Night. I was whole. The memory shifted, turning darker. I was 19. The yellow sweater was gone, replaced by a tailored suit that felt like armor. My mother stood behind me, her hands on my shoulders. Not a hug, but a restraint. "Smile, Lucian," she whispered. "The head of the Vaughn family is looking this way. Do you know how much your father's debt is? Do you know what happens to us if you don't impress him?" I looked across the ballroom. That was the first time I saw Elias. He stood there, a glass of expensive whiskey in his hand, watching me like I was a piece of art he was deciding whether or not to buy. I didn't see the evil alpha then. I just saw a way to save my father. When he walked over and touched my chin, tilting my head up to inspect my eyes, I didn't pull away. "He's perfect," Elias said to my mother. "Not to me. Never to me. I'll take him." That was the night I stopped drawing. That was the night the colors died. I blinked. The cabin came back slowly. The crackling fire, the pale winter light spilling across the kitchen floor, the distant groan of ice shifting on the lake. For a moment, I could still feel Elias's fingers under my chin. 7 years ago, I had wanted to paint sunsets in Paris. At 22, I didn't even own a sketchbook anymore. The realization settled heavily in my chest. I stood abruptly and crossed the cabin toward the kitchen, suddenly unable to breathe beneath the weight of the memory. The cabinet doors creaked when I opened them. A rusted tin box sat shoved in the back corner. I frowned, pulled it out, and opened it. It was full of junk. Old batteries, a broken watch, a takeout menu from a restaurant that had probably closed years ago. And at the bottom, a pencil. Short, dull, chewed on the end like someone had been thinking hard. My fingers froze. For a long moment, I just stared at it. Then, slowly, carefully, I picked it up. Something twisted painfully inside my chest. Felt foreign in my hand. Like holding an old friend who didn't recognize me anymore. I walked to the window. The lake was still frozen. The sky was the same gray as the day I arrived. Nothing had changed. I stood there until the sun set, the pencil warm in my palm, letting myself think about the boy in the yellow sweater. He was still in there somewhere, buried, but not gone. I set the pencil on the windowsill, a small offering, promise I wasn't ready to make. I wondered what it would feel like to draw again. The pencil sat on the windowsill for 3 days. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment. The truth was simpler and uglier. I was afraid of it. Every time I walked past, I felt its weight. It wasn't just wood and graphite. It was a ghost. To pick it up was to admit that I still had a heart left to express. And that felt dangerous. So I let it sit. And I pretended it didn't matter. The peace of the cabin didn't last. The kitchen pipe burst on the 4th morning. A violent crack of frozen metal. Then a spray of icy lake water across the floor. I stood there in my socks, clutching a wrench I didn't know how to use, feeling that familiar wave of helplessness rising in my throat. I had no idea how to fix pipes. Elias had never let me touch anything practical. "That's what omegas have alphas for," he had once said. "You just need to look pretty and keep quiet." I had kept quiet. Now I didn't know how to thaw a pipe. The water kept coming. Cold. Relentless. I looked at the address Silas had given me. 2 miles wasn't far, but the walk was grueling in the slush. By the time I reached his cabin, larger than mine, built of heavy cedar and smelling of split wood, my breath came in ragged gasps and my socks were soaked through. Silas was outside, splitting logs with a rhythmic, terrifying grace. He didn't have a shirt on despite the cold. His skin steamed in the morning air. The muscles in his back shifted with every strike. A body built for survival, not for show. I stopped at the edge of his clearing. Cold. Shivering. Silas. He didn't miss a beat. The axe buried itself in the wood. And he turned. His gray eyes swept over my wet shoes and the damp hem of my jeans. "I need your help." "The pipe?" he asked. "How did you know?" "That cabin hasn't been maintained in years," he said, grabbing a shirt from a nearby stump. "Elias only came here once or twice a year. He didn't care about the plumbing." He tossed the axe aside and grabbed a toolbox from his porch. "Let's go." The walk back was silent, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was just quiet. Silas moved through the woods like he belonged to them, and I found myself stepping into his footprints to make the trek easier. At my cabin, he dropped to his knees in the kitchen. I watched his large hands work with the pipes. Hands that could clearly break things, yet moved with strange precision. He didn't get frustrated when a valve stuck or when water sprayed across his shirt. He just adjusted and kept going. In less than 30 minutes, he was done. "You're good at this," I said, leaning against the counter. "Had to learn," he said. "No one else was going to do it for me." I didn't say anything. I just nodded. He stood up and wiped his hands on a rag. That should hold. Thank you, I said. How much is? No. I blinked. Silas looked at me. His gray eyes were steady. You don't owe me anything, he said. I'm just helping a neighbor. Something in my chest tightened unexpectedly at the words. Thank you, I said again, quieter this time. He held my gaze for a second longer. Then he nodded. His eyes drifted toward the windowsill. The pencil. His gaze lingered there for a moment. Longer than it should have. You draw? He asked. The question landed somewhere soft inside me. I hadn't been asked that in years. I used to, I said. What happened? I looked at the pencil, then back at him. Life. He didn't comment. He just nodded like he understood something I hadn't said aloud. Then he walked toward the window and picked up the pencil carefully between his fingers. I used to draw too, he said quietly. When I was younger, before my dad died. He was a carpenter. He used to say drawing was just thinking out loud with your hands. I stared at him. I hadn't expected that. What did you draw? I asked. He turned the pencil slowly between his fingers. Horses, trees, the lake, nothing good. But I liked the way it felt. Like the world made sense for a little while. Something cracked open in my chest. Just a little. When did you stop? He set the pencil back on the windowsill. When I realized no one was going to pay me to do it. I almost laughed. Almost. You could start again, I said. Silas looked at me, his gray eyes unreadable. Could you? The question hung between us. I didn't answer. He stayed longer than he needed to. We sat on the floor by the wood stove, 2 mugs of coffee between us, the pipes silent and fixed. The fire crackled softly while the wind pressed against the windows. And somehow we started talking. Not about Elias. Not about the past. Just small things. He told me about the first birdhouse he built when he was 12 and how it had collapsed onto his father's head 5 minutes later. I laughed. A real laugh, rusty and unfamiliar, like a door opening after years of being stuck shut. Silas looked at me over the rim of his mug. You have a nice laugh, he said. You should do it more. Heat crept unexpectedly into my face. I looked away. I forgot I could. Silas tilted his head slightly. So, the drawing. You never answered me. Answered what? Could you start again? I thought about the boy in the yellow sweater. The one who used to fill sketchbooks before the world convinced him his hands belonged to someone else. I don't know, I admitted. Silas nodded once. Fair enough. Then he smiled. Just a little. Tell you what, he said. If you ever do draw again, you should draw me. I blinked. What? You heard me. He leaned back against the wall, relaxed and infuriatingly confident. I'm very drawable. Strong jaw. Good bone structure. I'd make an excellent charcoal sketch. I stared at him. Then, despite myself, I laughed again. Louder this time. You're ridiculous. I'm practical, he replied. If you're going to get back on the horse, you might as well start with a good view. I shook my head, still smiling. Felt strange on my face. Like wearing clothes that used to fit perfectly but had been packed away for years. And what if I draw you ugly? I asked. Silas shrugged. Then I'll know you're lying. I looked at him, really looked at him. The sharp angles of his jaw. The way the firelight caught the gray in his eyes. The quiet steadiness of him. Like a tree that had survived more winters than it showed. Maybe, I said slowly. Maybe one day. Who knows? Something flickered across his face. One day, he repeated softly, like he was testing the shape of the words. Then he stood, grabbing his toolbox. See you around, artist. Bye, I said, laughing softly. Then he stepped out into the snow. I watched him disappear into the trees. The cabin felt different after he left. Still quiet, but warmer. I walked to the windowsill and picked up the pencil. I didn't draw anything. Not yet. But I didn't put it back on the sill either. I carried it to the kitchen table and set it carefully in the center. Then I poured myself another cup of coffee and stared out at the frozen lake. Maybe one day, The words echoed quietly in my chest. Silas had been gone for 2 hours, but the air in the cabin still seemed faintly altered by his presence. "I'm very drawable," he'd said with that quiet confidence of his. The words lingered in my head longer than they should have. I cleared the kitchen table and sat down slowly. The chair creaked beneath me. Outside, snowmelt dripped steadily from the roof. I pulled a blank sheet of paper from the stack I'd bought in town. Then I closed my eyes and pictured him. The broad shape of his shoulders, the sharp line of his jaw, the slight curl of dark hair near the nape of his neck. The way his gray eyes didn't look at me, but into me. My fingers tightened around the pencil. I pressed the graphite to the page. And suddenly, I was back in the sunroom of the Vaughn mansion. The light had been perfect that afternoon. Warm sunlight spilled across the marble floor while I sat near the fountain with a sketchbook balanced on my knees. I was drawing one of the small birds perched near the water, carefully shading the curve of its wing with charcoal I bought with Elias's money. For a little while, I had forgotten where I was. A shadow fell across the page. "Is that what you do all day?" Elias's voice carried that familiar low boredom that always made my stomach tighten. I looked up slowly. He stood behind me in a dark suit, one hand tucked into his pocket, a half-finished glass of whiskey in the other. "It's just a hobby, Elias," I whispered. He reached down before I could react and took the sketchbook from my hands. His thumb dragged carelessly across the bird's wing, smearing the charcoal. "It's a distraction," he said flatly. Then he tore the page out. Slowly, deliberately, the sound of ripping paper seemed louder than it should have. "Your hands belong to me, Lucian," he said, crumpling the drawing between his fingers. "Not to this trash." I stared at the ruined page in silence. "If I see you holding a pencil again," he continued quietly, "I'll make sure you can't hold a fork. Do you understand me?" My throat tightened. "Yes." He dropped the crumpled paper into my lap and walked away. The fountain kept running. The bird still sat there beside the water. And I remember thinking how strange it was that the world could continue so normally while something inside me was breaking apart. I blinked hard. The cabin returned slowly around me. The crackling fire, the pale blue light outside the windows, the cold air brushing against my skin. The pencil snapped between my fingers. I gasped softly and pulled my hand back as if the graphite had burned me. A jagged black line cut violently across the paper. My hand was shaking, not just a tremor, but a deep, uncontrollable shudder that ran all the way into my chest. "Your hands belong to me." "No," I whispered into the empty cabin. "You're dead." The words sounded small. I forced myself to pick up the broken half of the pencil. I tried again. I tried to sketch the curve of Silas's ear, the line of his shoulders, the shape of his mouth when he was trying not to smile. But every mark I made felt wrong. Elias's voice lingered in the corners of my mind like smoke trapped in old curtains. The colors I had started to feel these past few days were suddenly buried beneath something cold and heavy. My chest tightened painfully. Before I could stop myself, I threw the pencil across the room. It struck the wooden wall with a hollow sound before disappearing somewhere behind the stove. The cabin fell silent again. Only my uneven breathing remained. I stood abruptly and walked to the window. Outside, the lake had turned a deep winter blue. The ice groaned softly beneath the pressure of the coming spring. I looked down at my hands. The hands Elias claimed belonged to him. They were rougher now than they used to be, red from the cold, marked by small burns from the stove and thin scratches from chopping wood. They looked more like my hands than they had in years. Still, they trembled. One day, I murmured quietly to the frozen lake, but when I looked back at the torn paper lying crookedly on the table, I wondered if one day was a promise I was actually strong enough to keep. I spent the next morning pretending the kitchen table was just a table again, and not a graveyard for failed attempts. The broken pencil was still behind the stove. I left it there. I wasn't ready to reach for it, and I wasn't ready to admit I wanted to. The knock on the door came at 10. I didn't have to guess who it was. The sound was firm and steady, lacking the frantic rhythm of my mother or the cold entitlement the Vaughns carried into every room they entered. It was Silas. I opened the door just a crack. He stood there with a small wooden crate balanced in his arms, his dark hair damp from melted snow. "Morning," he said. "Morning. Brought some extra eggs and a jar of my aunt's preserves," he said, shifting the crate slightly. "She makes too much. Figured you could use a break from store-bought bread." "Thank you," I said, stepping aside to let him in. Cold air swept briefly into the cabin before the door shut behind him. Silas carried the crate to the kitchen table and set it down carefully, directly on top of the paper scarred by the jagged black line from yesterday. He reached inside the crate and pulled out a jar of blackberry jam before moving the box aside. The damaged paper was exposed again. So was the snapped graphite. Silas looked at the paper for a quiet moment. Then his eyes lifted to mine. "Rough start?" he asked gently. I leaned back against the counter, folding my arms loosely across my chest. "I tried," I admitted quietly. "I couldn't do it." Silas didn't rush to fill the silence. Instead, he slipped a hand into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folding knife. The brass handle was worn smooth with age, the blade carefully maintained. Without a word, he picked up the longer half of the broken pencil. "My dad used to say a broken tool isn't a ruined tool," Silas said as he flicked the knife open. "It just needs a new edge." I watched him work. His large hands moved carefully, turning the pencil slowly while the blade shaved thin curls of wood onto the table. The cabin stayed quiet except for the soft scrape of metal against wood. "Sometimes," Silas continued, still focused on the pencil, "the things people tell us about ourselves are lies." A thin curl of graphite fell onto the table. "They tell us we're only meant for one thing because they're afraid of what we'd become if we realized we were meant for more." Something tightened painfully in my throat. He finished sharpening the point, cleaner and sharper than before, and placed the pencil gently beside the paper. "Elias said my hands were only for looking pretty," I said before I could stop myself. "That I shouldn't draw." The words settled heavily between us. For the briefest second, Silas's grip tightened around the knife handle hard enough for his knuckles to pale. But his voice remained calm. "Elias Vaughn was a man who only knew how to own things," he said quietly. His gray eyes lifted to mine. "But you aren't an object, Lucian." The way he said my name made something inside me ache unexpectedly. Then, more carefully this time, he reached toward me. He paused long enough to let me pull away if I wanted to. I didn't. His rough fingers wrapped gently around my right hand. His palm was warm from the knife handle, his touch steady and grounding in a way I wasn't used to. Not possessive, just warm. "I think you'd make an excellent artist," he said softly. My chest tightened painfully at the simple sincerity in his voice. He let go a moment later, but the warmth of his hand lingered against my skin. "I can't draw yet," I admitted. "Every time I try, it feels wrong." Silas nodded once as if he understood perfectly. Then, to my surprise, he picked the pencil up. "Then don't draw anything important yet." He held the pencil loosely over the paper and tilted his head slightly. "Draw a circle," he said. "One ugly circle. That's all." I stared at the blank page, at the sharpened pencil, at the man standing quietly in my kitchen, refusing to let me disappear inside my own fear. Slowly, I reached out. My fingers brushed his briefly as I took the pencil from his hand. The contact was small, accidental, but it still sent something strange and nervous through my chest. I lowered my eyes to the paper. My hand trembled immediately, but this time I didn't stop. The graphite touched the page. I drew a circle. It was uneven. The lines didn't connect properly at the top. It leaned awkwardly to one side. It barely looked like a circle at all. Still, when I finished, I let out a shaky breath that felt trapped somewhere deep inside me for years. Silas looked down at the page. "See," he said quietly. "The world didn't end." A small laugh escaped me before I could stop it. I looked up at him. "Thank you, Silas." He smiled then. Not the small amused smirk from before, but something softer, real enough to reach his eyes. Don't thank me yet, artist, he said. You still owe me that sketch of my jawline. I laughed again, and this time the sound came easier, lighter. Sit down, I said, gesturing toward the chair across from me. And stay still. You're very drawable. Remember? Silas raised an eyebrow like he'd just won something important. Then he sat. Sunlight slowly climbed higher across the frozen lake outside the window while I studied the lines of his face. The sharp angle of his jaw. The faint scar near his chin. The quiet steadiness in his expression. My hand still trembled when I began. But this time the pencil stayed in my grip. And for the first time in years I didn't feel like I was drawing a ghost. I was drawing the man who was helping me see the colors again. Silas sat across from me at the kitchen table, trying very hard to stay still. He wasn't good at it. His knee bounced beneath the table. His jaw flexed every few seconds. His eyes kept drifting from the window back to my face like he was cataloging every expression without realizing it. I glanced up from the sketchbook. You're staring. You're drawing me, he said easily. I'm allowed to stare back. That's not how it works. That's exactly how it works. His mouth twitched slightly. Also, you have graphite on your cheek. I froze. Where? Left side. Near your nose. I wiped my cheek quickly. Silas laughed softly. The other left. I hate you. No, you don't. I looked up at him then. The corner of his mouth was lifted slightly, and the amber firelight caught in his gray eyes, warming them into something softer. I looked back down before he noticed me staring back. The sketch was rough, but steadier than the others had been. The lines came easier now. Not perfect, not confident, but mine. I traced the slope of his forehead carefully, then the sharp line of his jaw. There was a faint scar near his chin I hadn't noticed before today. My pencil slowed while I shaded near the corner of his eye. The graphite lingered too long against the page. And suddenly, I wasn't sitting in the cabin anymore. The front door of the Vaughn mansion opened just after midnight. I was standing in the kitchen washing dishes I hadn't been allowed to leave in the sink overnight. Elias had been gone for 3 days. For 3 quiet days, the house had almost felt empty enough to breathe in. Then I heard laughter. 2 voices. Elias's low, familiar drawl, and another voice younger, nervous. I dried my hands slowly and walked toward the entryway. Elias stood near the front doors with one hand resting casually on the shoulder of an alpha I didn't recognize. The boy couldn't have been much older than me. 20 maybe. Dark curly hair, rumpled shirt, crooked collar. He smelled faintly like expensive cologne buried beneath cheap whiskey. His eyes darted around the mansion like he already regretted stepping inside. Lucian, Elias said, smiling. It was the smile he wore when he was about to enjoy himself. The smile that usually meant someone else would suffer for it. This is Adrian, he continued smoothly. He'll be staying with us tonight. I looked at the boy. Adrian still wouldn't meet my eyes. I'll prepare the guest room, I said quietly. No. The word landed heavily in the marble entryway. I looked back at Elias. Adrian will be staying in our room. Silence pressed painfully against my ears. I looked at Adrian again. His face had gone pale. Elias, I said carefully. May I speak with you privately? Why? Elias asked lightly. You can say anything in front of Adrian. He's family now. Family. The word twisted unpleasantly in my stomach. Elias, please. He moved before I could finish. His hand closed around my wrist. Not hard enough to bruise. Just hard enough to remind me he could. You knew what you were when I married you, Lucian, he said softly, almost gently. You're my Omega. That doesn't make you my only one. Then he let go. Adrian stared at the floor like he wanted it to swallow him whole. And suddenly I understood. That was the worst part. If he had looked arrogant, I could have hated him easily. If he had looked pleased with himself, I could have dismissed him. But he just looked ashamed, young, uncomfortable, trapped in a situation bigger than him, maybe scared of Elias too. You'll sleep on the couch tonight, Elias said as he turned toward the staircase. Unless you'd rather watch. Adrian flinched hard enough for me to notice. I didn't. I simply stood there barefoot on the cold marble floor while they disappeared upstairs together. Adrian never looked back. Later, I sat alone on the couch in the dark. I pressed my palms against my ears until they hurt. The sounds from upstairs still found me anyway. I didn't cry. By then, I had almost forgotten how. The next morning, Elias made me cook breakfast for both of them. Eggs, toast, coffee with too much cream, exactly the way he liked it. Adrian sat stiffly at the table with his hands folded tightly in his lap. He barely touched the food. He never once looked directly at me. When he finally left a few hours later through the side entrance, he paused briefly near the doorway. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Then he disappeared. Elias kissed my forehead afterward like he was rewarding a well-trained pet. "You're a good Omega," he murmured. "Loyal. I'll keep you." As if being kept was something precious. As if possession and love were the same thing. "Lucian." Silas's voice cut cleanly through the memory. I blinked slowly. The cabin returned in fragments. The fire crackling softly behind us. Pale winter light spilling across the kitchen floor. Graphite beneath my fingertips. But my chest still felt trapped back inside that mansion. I stared at the sketchbook without really seeing it. Then suddenly warmth touched my hand. I flinched violently. The pencil slipped from my fingers and rolled across the table. Silas wasn't sitting across from me anymore. He was kneeling beside my chair, one large hand wrapped gently around mine. Only then did I realize how tightly I'd been gripping the pencil. My knuckles were white. The muscles in my wrist ached. "Hey," Silas said softly. "You okay?" I opened my mouth to answer. Nothing came out. Then something warm hit the back of my hand. A tear. Another followed quietly after it. I stared down at them in confusion. I wasn't sobbing. I wasn't even breathing hard. The tears were simply falling silently, one after another, as though my body had finally grown tired of carrying 3 years of loneliness by itself. "I'm sorry," I whispered. My voice cracked embarrassingly on the words. I tried wiping my face with my sleeve, but my hand shook too badly. "I'm okay. Really. We can keep going." I almost got the chin right. I reached toward the pencil again. Silas tightened his hold on my hand slightly. "No," he said gently. "We're done for today." But I was almost finished. A weak laugh escaped me. "You're very drawable, remember? Don't ruin your own debut." That earned the faintest smile from him. "I'm not going anywhere." The simple certainty of the words settled somewhere painfully soft inside my chest. His thumb brushed slowly across my knuckles in a quiet, grounding motion. "The sketch can wait," he said quietly. "We can finish it another time." I took a shaky breath. Then another. Gradually the trembling eased. I wiped the remaining tears from my face, feeling strangely hollowed out afterward. Lighter somehow. Like something poisonous had finally started leaving my body. "Okay," I murmured softly. "Okay. I'm better." Silas didn't move immediately. He stayed beside me for another few seconds like he was making sure I wouldn't disappear back into the memory if he let go too quickly. Then, slowly, something playful flickered back into his expression. "So," he said carefully, "if we're stopping, does that mean I finally get to see it?" He reached toward the sketchbook. "No." I grabbed it instantly and pressed it against my chest. Silas blinked. Then one eyebrow lifted slowly. "It's unfinished," I defended quickly. "It's a work in progress." "Unfinished." His mouth twitched. "You've been staring at my face for 40 minutes. I deserve to know if you captured my good side. The artist's ego requires privacy." "Oh, does it?" He stood up slowly, towering over me now but somehow never feeling threatening. "Well," he continued, taking one deliberate step closer, "as the model, I believe I have legal rights to the artwork." I narrowed my eyes suspiciously. "You absolutely do not. We should check local laws." He made a slow grab for the sketchbook. I yelped and darted sideways around the kitchen island, hugging the book protectively against my chest. "It's private property." "I fixed your pipes, Lucian." Silas followed after me, clearly amused now. That earns me lifetime warranty privileges. You fixed them once. Exactly. Premium service. I laughed despite myself as I dodged around the counter again. The heaviness from earlier loosened little by little with every step. Silas reached again. I twisted away. Then my sock caught against the edge of the rug. The world tilted suddenly beneath me. Before I could fall, Silas caught me firmly around the waist. The laughter disappeared. The sketchbook ended up trapped awkwardly between our chests, forgotten completely. His arm held me steady with effortless strength. Warmth radiated through the layers of his flannel shirt. I could feel the slow rhythm of his heartbeat beneath my hand. For a moment, neither of us moved. I looked up. Silas wasn't looking at the sketchbook anymore. He was looking at me. Really looking. Like he was memorizing me the same way I had spent the afternoon memorizing the shape of his face. The room suddenly felt very small. "You're beautiful, Lucian," he said quietly. My breath caught. Something unsteady moved through my chest so sharply it almost hurt. Silas seemed to feel it too. His grip tightened slightly before he slowly stepped back, carefully letting go of my waist. A strange silence settled between us. Silas cleared his throat softly and took a small step toward the door. "I should probably head home," he said, his voice lower now. I nodded because I wasn't entirely sure I trusted my voice anymore. At the door, he paused with one hand resting against the frame. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked quietly. I swallowed once before answering. "Same time." A small smile touched the corner of his mouth. Then he stepped outside into the fading snowlight. The door clicked shut behind him. I stood there for a long moment afterward with the sketchbook still pressed against my chest and my heartbeat refusing to calm down. The sketch sat on the kitchen table for 2 days. It wasn't good. The proportions were slightly wrong. One shoulder sat lower than the other. The shading near Silas's jaw was uneven, where my hand had started shaking again. But it was real. That mattered more than anything else. By the end of the week, the snow around the cabin had started to melt. Water dripped from the roof each morning. The frozen edges of the lake cracked softly during the afternoons, the sound carrying through the trees like distant thunder. Spring was coming, the same way healing seemed to. I was stacking firewood beside the porch when Silas appeared at the edge of the driveway. He lifted a hand in greeting. "There's a market in town today," he said, walking toward me. "Food stalls. Local vendors. Margaret's probably going to force everyone to buy her pies again." I smiled despite myself. "Sounds dangerous." "It is. Last year she nearly started a fight over blueberry filling." A quiet laugh escaped me. Silas shoved his hands into his jacket pockets, watching me carefully. "You should come." The smile faded slightly. Crowds. People staring. I looked away toward the lake. "I don't know." He nodded immediately like he'd expected the answer. "Okay." The fact that he didn't push, that he never pushed, made something in my chest ache. "You really think your neighborly duties include dragging traumatized widowers to pie festivals?" I asked lightly. Silas tilted his head. "I think you've been hiding in that cabin long enough." The words weren't cruel, just honest. He glanced at the half-stacked firewood beside me. "I'll make you a deal. You come to the market for 1 hour, and I'll carry the heavy firewood next time." I stared at him. "That's your negotiation tactic?" "It's worked so far." Another laugh slipped out, quieter this time. Silas's expression softened at the sound. 1 hour, he said. I looked down at the damp ground beneath my boots. Then I sighed. 1 hour. The town looked different without snow falling over it. Streets crowded with people carrying paper cups of coffee and baskets filled with bread, flowers, and handmade crafts. Children ran between booths. Music drifted from somewhere near the church square. The noise pressed against me immediately. Too many voices. Too many scents. Too many eyes. My shoulders tightened before I could stop them. Silas noticed. He slowed his pace beside me. Steady, unhurried. Silently giving me room to breathe. "Margaret's pie stand is over there," he said casually, pointing ahead. "Prepare yourself emotionally." I glanced at him. You're very dramatic for someone who lives alone in the woods. I contain multitudes. Another small laugh startled its way out of me. The market smelled like cinnamon, coffee, and melting snow, and color. Bright yellow flower bouquets sat outside one vendor stall. Hand-woven scarves fluttered in the wind beside painted signs and glass jars filled with jam. I caught myself staring at the colors without meaning to, noticing them. A woman nearby sold watercolor paintings of the lake in early spring. Pale blues, deep greens, soft gold sunlight breaking across the water. Something twisted quietly in my chest. I used to paint like that. We stopped near Margaret's booth. The older woman beamed the moment she saw us. "Well," she said, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. "Would you look at that?" Silas sighed beside me. "Don't start." "Oh, I absolutely will." Margaret pointed a pie server at him accusingly. "You never bring people anywhere." "I'm literally standing right here," I muttered. Margaret ignored me completely. Then she looked at me properly, really looked. "You look healthier," she said, her voice gentler now. "Less pale." The observation caught me off guard. Before I could answer, a voice cut through the crowd nearby. "That's Elias Vaughn's Omega, isn't it?" My body went rigid instantly. The noise of the market blurred around the edges. I hated how quickly the fear returned. How easily. Silas turned before I could. His expression didn't change, but his voice was calm and steady when he answered. "His name is Lucian." The conversation nearby stumbled into silence. Silas looked back at me then, his gray eyes steady. "You okay?" I swallowed carefully. "Yeah," I said quietly, and for the first time I almost meant it. By the time we returned to the cabin, the sun had started sinking behind the trees. I was exhausted. Being around people again felt like using muscles I hadn't touched in years. Silas carried a paper bag filled with bread and jam into the kitchen and set it on the counter. "You survived," he said. "Barely. I'll alert the newspapers." I rolled my eyes, but a smile found its way onto my face anyway. Then Silas's gaze drifted toward the sketch on the kitchen table. The unfinished drawing of him. He walked over and picked it up carefully. I tensed. "It's not finished. I can see that." He studied it quietly. Then, "My nose is crooked here. You kept moving. I was breathing. Breathing is moving. I told you that." He looked up at me, and his mouth curved into that slow smile, the one that made his gray eyes warm. "You're very bossy for someone who draws crooked noses, and you're very opinionated for someone who can't sit still." He set the sketch back down and walked toward me. The cabin suddenly felt smaller. "Thank you," I said, before I could stop myself. "For what?" "For today. For not leaving when I cry. For fixing my pipes." I let out a shaky breath. "For looking at me like I'm not broken." Silas stopped a few feet away. His expression shifted. Something softer underneath the usual steadiness. "You're not broken, Lucian. I don't feel whole. Maybe you don't have to feel whole to feel something else." The words landed somewhere deep. We stood there in the fading light. The fire crackled behind us. The lake groaned softly under the thinning ice. And I realized, suddenly, terrifyingly, wonderfully, that I wanted to kiss him. Not because I was lonely. Not because he was kind. Because I wanted to. I moved before I could talk myself out of it. One step, then another. Silas didn't move back. Didn't move forward. He just stood there, watching me with those gray eyes, waiting to see what I would do. I stopped close enough to feel the warmth of him. Close enough to count the small flecks of silver in his irises. "Lucian," he said quietly, "what are you doing?" I didn't answer. I rose onto my toes. I pressed my mouth to his. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't practiced. My lips were cold from the walk, and I angled wrong at first. Too far left, too soft, too nervous. But then Silas made a small sound. A breath. A catch. And his hand came up to cup the back of my neck. He kissed me back. Slowly. Gently. Like he had all the time in the world. His lips were warm. His fingers threaded into the hair at my nape. He tilted his head slightly, adjusting the angle, and the kiss deepened just enough to make my knees feel unreliable. When he pulled back, his forehead rested against mine, both of us breathing unevenly. "Okay," he murmured. "That was—" "Yeah," I whispered. He laughed softly. The sound vibrated through his chest and into mine. "I was going to say unexpected," he said. "Liar." "Fine. I was going to say long overdue." I pulled back just enough to look at him. His eyes were soft. His mouth was slightly reddened. He looked at me like I had given him something precious. "You kissed me first," he said. "Don't let it go to your head. Too late." I laughed. A real laugh, bright and startled. Silas smiled and brushed his thumb across my cheekbone. The touch was feather-light, reverent. "I should go," he said quietly. "You always say that." "Because I always should." He didn't move. "But I don't want to." The words hung between us. I looked at his mouth, then back at his eyes. "Then don't," I said. Silas exhaled slowly. He didn't leave. We sat on the floor by the wood stove, shoulder to shoulder, the sketchbook forgotten on the table. The fire crackled. The cabin settled around us. Silas's hand rested on the floor beside mine, close enough that our pinkies touched. Neither of us moved them away. "Tell me something," he said quietly. "What?" "Something you used to love. Before everything." I stared at the fire for a long moment. "The smell of turpentine," I said finally, "and the way the light hits a canvas in the afternoon. Yellow. I used to love yellow." Silas was quiet. Then, "There's a field behind my cabin," he said. "In the summer, it's full of wildflowers." I looked at him. "Yellow ones." "Some of them." He turned his head to meet my eyes. "I'll show you when they bloom." I looked down at our hands, pinkies still touching, his skin warm against mine. "Okay," I whispered. The fire burned low as evening settled around the cabin. Outside, the ice on the lake cracked softly beneath the slow arrival of spring. Silas's shoulder rested against mine, warm and solid, and somewhere between the sound of the fire and the steady brush of his fingers against my hand, I found myself thinking about summer. Yellow flowers, open windows, paint under my fingernails again. The thought should have scared me. Instead, I closed my eyes and let myself want it. I woke to an empty cabin. The fire had burned down to embers, leaving the room cool and quiet. Pale morning light slipped through the windows in thin blue streaks. For one brief, disorienting moment, I thought I had imagined all of it. The market, the kiss, the warmth of Silas beside me on the floor. Then I saw his jacket draped over the back of the chair. He hadn't left. I sat up slowly, wincing at the ache in my back from sleeping against the wood stove. My lips still remembered the shape of his. The cabin was quiet, too quiet. I stood and walked to the window. Outside, the lake stretched gray beneath the cloudy morning sky. The ice had cracked further overnight, thin silver fractures spreading across the surface like veins beneath glass. Then I saw him. Silas sat on the porch steps with a tin coffee cup resting between his hands. Steam curled upward into the cold air. His shoulders looked relaxed, but there was something thoughtful in the way he stared out at the lake. He had stayed, and suddenly that felt more frightening than if he had left. What happens now? I opened the door. Cold air brushed against my face. Silas turned at the sound, his gray eyes finding mine. "Morning," he said. "Morning." His voice was calm, steady, like yesterday hadn't scared him away. I hesitated for half a second before stepping outside and sitting beside him. Not touching, just close enough to feel the warmth coming off his shoulder. Silas held the coffee cup out toward me. I took it carefully, our fingers brushing for only a second. The warmth seeped into my hands. For a while, neither of us spoke. The woods were quiet except for distant birdsong and the occasional groan of shifting ice out on the lake. Then Silas broke the silence. "Last night," he said slowly. "What did it mean to you?" My chest tightened. I stared down into the coffee. What did it mean? I wanted to say everything. I wanted to say I don't know. I wanted to say please don't make me answer because I'm afraid of saying the wrong thing and losing this. I opened my mouth, but no words came. And suddenly, another memory surfaced before I could stop it. Elias sat across from me at the long dining table, candlelight flickering against the crystal glasses between us. He had been quieter than usual that evening, calm in a way that made me uneasy. "Lucian," he said, swirling wine lazily in his glass. "What do you want?" I remember blinking at him in surprise. No one had asked me that in a long time. I hesitated carefully. "I'd like to see Leo." Elias looked up. "My friend," I added quickly. "Just for an afternoon." For a moment, his expression didn't change at all. Then something in his eyes cooled. "You want to leave this house?" "Just for a few hours." "No." The answer came instantly. I lowered my gaze. "I understand. You don't need friends, Lucian," Elias said smoothly. "You have me. You want for nothing." The conversation ended there. But I learned something important that night. What do you want was never really a question. It was a test. And the safest answer was always nothing. The wind shifted across the porch, cool against my skin. I blinked and looked down at the coffee in my hands. Silas was still beside me, still waiting. "I don't really know how to answer that," I admitted quietly. "I don't think I remember how to want things anymore." Silas leaned his forearms against his knees. "Try anyway," he said softly. I swallowed. The lake stretched endlessly ahead of us, gray and breaking apart at the edges. "I want." The words caught in my throat. I tried again. "I want to stop being afraid every time something good happens." My fingers tightened slightly around the cup. "I want to sleep without checking the locks 3 times. I want to draw without hearing Elias's voice in my head." I laughed weakly under my breath. "I want a lot of impossible things, apparently." Silas didn't smile. He just listened. "And I want this," I said finally, quieter now. "Whatever this is. I just don't know what to call it yet." For a long moment he said nothing. Then, quietly, "You don't have to be afraid of me." The words settled somewhere deep inside my chest. "I know," I whispered. Silas turned his head then, looking directly at me. "I need you to tell me what you want," he said. "Even if the answer is I don't know yet." Especially then. Something in my throat tightened painfully. I looked away before he could see it too clearly. "What about you?" I asked after a moment. "What do you want?" Silas exhaled slowly, his breath fogging in the cold air. "I want to keep showing up here in the mornings," he said. "I want coffee on your porch. I want to see you draw things that make you happy again." His mouth curved. "And yeah," he added quieter now, "I'd really like to kiss you again." Heat crept into my face before I could stop it. "That's a lot of wants." "I've had some time to think about them." A small laugh slipped out of me. Silas smiled at the sound. Then he asked, "So what do we do now?" I looked at him properly then, at the scar near his chin, the tired softness around his eyes, the patience in the way he waited for my answer instead of deciding it for me. And maybe that was the difference. Elias had always told me what I was. Silas asked, "Can we just keep going like this?" I asked quietly. "No promises yet. No pressure. Just this." Silas nodded once. "This?" he repeated. "Yeah." His expression softened. "Okay." We stayed on the porch until the coffee turned cold. The sun climbed slowly higher through the trees, pale light spreading across the frozen lake. Somewhere in the distance, water dripped steadily from melting branches. Silas stood first. "I should probably get back," he said. "Wood doesn't chop itself." I looked up at him, the morning light catching against the dark strands of his hair. "Thank you," I said. "For what?" "For staying." He bent slightly and pressed a soft kiss against my forehead. Then he straightened and headed toward the trees. I watched him disappear between the pines until the woods swallowed him whole. I walked back to the kitchen table. The unfinished sketch of Silas still rested there. Uneven shoulders, crooked nose, all of it. I picked up the pencil. My hand stayed steady. This time I didn't try to draw him. I closed my eyes and pictured the field he had described. Wildflowers. Yellow ones. I lowered the pencil to the page. Slowly, lines began to take shape. Thin stems bending toward sunlight. Loose petals opening wide. Wildflowers growing unevenly across the paper. Tangled and alive. The proportions weren't perfect. Some of the shading turned muddy where I pressed too hard. But the drawing breathed. I sat back after a while and looked down at the page. The flowers stretched wildly across the paper, reaching in every direction without apology. Outside, the ice on the lake cracked again, softer this time. I set the pencil down and found myself smiling before I even realized it. Summer suddenly didn't feel so far away anymore. A month later, the windows stayed open during the afternoons now. Warm wind drifted through the rooms, carrying the smell of pine, lake water, and wildflowers from the hills beyond the trees. The snow was gone. So was the silence. Not completely. The cabin was still quiet most days. But it was no longer the hollow kind of quiet that used to press against my chest until I could barely breathe. Now it sounded like pencils scratching across paper. Coffee brewing in the mornings. Silas laughing somewhere outside while chopping wood badly on purpose because he knew it annoyed me. Life had returned in small pieces. Small enough that I almost hadn't noticed it happening. I sat on the porch steps with my sketchbook balanced on my knees. The late afternoon sun painted everything gold. The lake shimmered beyond the trees, no longer frozen and sharp, but soft blue and endlessly moving. Wildflowers had overtaken the field behind Silas's cabin exactly the way he promised they would. Yellow ones too. I smiled faintly as I shaded another petal onto the page. "You're doing that thing again." I looked up. Silas stood a few feet away, carrying a basket of groceries against his hip. "What thing?" "The tiny smile thing." He walked up the porch steps slowly. "You do it when you're drawing." "I do not." "You do." He set the basket beside the door. "It's very noticeable. Kind of smug, honestly." I rolled my eyes. Silas leaned down, trying to peek at the sketchbook. I immediately tilted it away from him. "No. Oh, come on." He pressed a hand dramatically against his chest. "After all these months, you still don't trust me with the artistic process? It's unfinished. You've been using that excuse since winter. Because you're distracting." His mouth curved slowly. "That's the nicest thing you've ever said to me." I laughed. He smiled at the sound like he always did, quiet and warm. Then his eyes drifted toward the page again. "What is it this time?" he asked. I hesitated. Then, slowly, I turned the sketchbook around. Silas looked down at the drawing. It was the field behind his cabin. Wildflowers bending in the summer wind. Tall grass. The outline of the lake in the distance. And near the center of the page, sitting beneath the shade of a pine tree, was Silas himself. He stared at it quietly for a long moment. Then he looked at me. "You drew me better this time," he said softly. "You sat still longer." "I did not." "You fell asleep." "I was resting my eyes." He sat down beside me on the porch step, his shoulder brushing mine naturally now, like we'd been doing this forever. For a while, neither of us spoke. The wind moved through the trees. Somewhere across the lake, a bird called out once, then fell silent. Then Silas reached down and linked his fingers loosely through mine. The gesture was so casual that it almost hurt, because there had been a time when I believed love only existed as possession. Control. A cage wrapped in diamond rings and whispered threats. Now it looked like this. Warm. Quiet. Asking nothing in return. "I don't miss them," I said quietly. Silas turned his head toward me. "Since Elias died," I continued, "I haven't seen my mother or the Vaughn family. Not once." I looked out at the lake. "And every day without them feels more peaceful than the last." Silas didn't comment. He just squeezed my hand. That was enough. "I was thinking about Paris again," I admitted after a while. "The studio?" I nodded. The dream felt strange to say out loud after all this time. Fragile. Young. But no longer impossible. I don't know if I'd ever actually go, I said. But I think I want to paint somewhere with big windows someday. Silas listened carefully. Sounds nice. I laughed softly. That's your response? What? You want me to pretend I know anything about art studios? He shrugged. I just know you'd make it beautiful. The words settled warmly into my chest. Not because they were dramatic, because he meant them so simply. The sun dipped lower across the lake, turning the water amber. I looked down at our joined hands. Months ago, I couldn't even hold a pencil without shaking. Now there was graphite beneath my fingernails again. There were sketches scattered across the cabin walls. Now there was someone beside me who asked what I wanted, and waited patiently for the answer. Healing hadn't arrived all at once. Came quietly, like spring melting ice from the edges inward. Silas squeezed my hand once. I looked at him. What? He asked. Nothing. But it wasn't really nothing. It was everything.